Now that our rig is complete and functional, it's time to get our dwarf hero moving as well. First, we'll learn how to attach the mesh to the skeleton with a binding process. We'll use the smooth skins for this process, so we can later modify the skin weights with the Paint Skin Weights tool. Once we have a good understanding of how the skin weights are affecting the mesh, we will open up the component editor and adjust the skins that way. We'll use the Paint Skin Weights tool and the component editor throughout the rest of this course, so familiarizing ourselves with them both puts us on the right track for completing this process quickly and efficiently. Before we begin attaching our Dwarf Hero mesh to the skeleton that we made, I'd like to do a little example here so we have a better understanding of how the Bind Skin tool is going to be working. So to do that, I'm going to go into the side view here and start by making a skeleton for what is going to be a noodle character. So it's going to be a little noodle arm again. So we'll go up into the rigging tab and we'll find the create joints tool. And I'm just going to make a little 3-joint spine here. So by holding X, I'm going to make sure I'm snapping to the grid so we can be sure that we're in a straight line. And I'm just going to place these right above each other like that and hit enter. And just while we're here, a little trick of the trade. If you select the joints that aren't the root joint, the ones following the root joint here, just shift select both of those, go into the channel box. You can see here they have a translate value. And if you just select the translate value and hit 8, just fill 8 in there and hit tab, you'll see that they'll evenly space each other out. And that's because our last joint was translated 8, but our middle joint here is only 6. So to make those nice and evenly spaced, we can just set them both to the same value. So that's just a nice little trickaroo for you, in case you were annoyed that those were not spaced properly. So now that we have our spine in there, I'm going to go into the polygons tab and create a quick mesh for this noodle. So of course it's going to be a cylinder. So I'll click the cylinder tool and it will create a cylinder at the center of our grid like always. So I'm just going to bring that up to the work area here. And I'm actually going to hold V down and snap this to the center joint. And I'll scale it from here. And that way I'm kind of getting a good scale here that'll match. And because we've evenly spaced everything, we know that we get a nice fit for those joints inside this mesh. So now that that's all in place, let's just make sure everything's looking good by going into the perspective view. And yes, indeed, everything looks fine. And in order to get this noodle to bend properly, we're going to need to input some edge loops here. So we can do that by going up into the channel box and finding the polygon cylinder 1 input and clicking that. And in here we'll see we have all the different values of this shape here. And what we're interested in is this subdivision height. So let's just add, we'll just put 10 in there. And when you add an input in there, you can see that it changes in the viewport. So if you zoom in, you can see now that we have 10 subdivisions in our cylinder. So that works just fine. So at this point, with our noodle, we've essentially done everything but created controllers. We're not going to bother with controllers. But essentially right now our noodle is just as prepared to be bound to the skeleton as our character is right now. So this is going to be kind of a dry run of what we're going to do with our character soon. Now we know if we try to rotate any of these joints, the mesh isn't going to follow because it has no reason to. So in order to get that functionality, we want to select our mesh, then shift select our root joint down here. And we want to go up to the skin tool up here. If you don't see this, make sure you're in the rigging tab like I am. So click on skin and look in this drop down, and right at the top you'll see bind skin. And we're just going to use the default settings, so we could click here first. But to ensure that we're all using the same settings, let's go into the options. And we want to go up to edit and reset settings. Don't worry about any of this stuff right now. We'll talk about that a little later. Right now we can safely use a default setting for this noodle because it's not super specific or anything. So at this point I'm just going to hit bind skin, and that will perform the tool action, which is binding the skin, and it'll also close out that window for us. You should notice that Maya selects our joint chain, and with that selected you can see in the channel box the outputs of the joints. We now have a bind pose and we now have a skin cluster, and that tells us that the joints are controlling skin clusters. So now if we grab the center joint there and give it a rotate, we can see that we get some nice noodle action with our noodle. So for this particular noodle character, it's pretty much done. There's not really a whole lot more that needs to be done with this. It's a pretty uniform shape. And if only every character were that simple. Unfortunately, our character is much more complex. So we're going to have to do a lot more stuff dealing with the skin weights. And that's more kind of behind the scenes stuff. So on our noodle, we can see some of that stuff by selecting the mesh here and going to the rigging tab over here, clicking that. And in here, you'll find a tool that kind of looks like a waffle with a paintbrush on it. And that is actually not a waffle, it's the Paint Skin Weights tool. So if you double click that, it'll open up this new window. I'm going to close the channel box because it's kind of cramped. And in here, we get a whole new bunch of options that maybe look kind of intimidating because there's quite a lot in here. But we're going to go through them and make them less scary. So let's just start off with what's obvious. We have our mesh selected, and we have new color scheme on our mesh. It's no longer just white. We have a gradient from blue to green here. And essentially what those gradients mean are the different weights of all the vertexes that we have. So back in this tool settings, if you look in this box down here, you can see we have our 3 joints that we made. This is an identical representation of our hierarchy. So we have our root joint. If you want to select that, you can. And then below that is our second joint, and below that is our third joint. And as you select those, you see the colors change. And that's because we're seeing the representations of all the skin weights for each joint individually. So when we have our root joint selected, or joint 1 selected, you can take a look at the mesh and notice that it's all red down here. And then as you move further away from that joint, it turns blue. And you can kind of think of it as a temperature. I think these are the colors that represent temperature as well. If you had like heat vision, you'd see hot stuff as red or white, and then you'd see cool stuff as blue or black. I think I'm just guessing that's the predator vision, the heat vision that would be represented. So that's kind of what they're using as an analogy here, is skin weights as heat essentially. So what we can tell from this heat pattern is the weights closest to the root joint are red. They're going to be following the root joint more directly. In other words, they're weighted more heavily to follow the root joint. And then as we move further away, we get up here to the top of the mesh. Essentially, nothing is going to be affected up here by the movement of the root joint itself. And if you click on our second joint here, you see a similar thing. You see where the joint is affecting the most, this middle part here, this kind of bicep area of our noodle, is going to be driven more closely or more accurately to the movements of our second joint here. And then lastly, if we select our third joint, we see that it's controlling a little bit of the top here, but not really anything down here. So if we want to look at those now, I'll explain them kind of as we move these joints. And you'll see that those colors represent the movement pretty effectively. So the root joint, we're not actually going to see a lot of movement because, as we know in our hierarchy, the root is actually controlling this whole system of joints. So it's moving everything. So we get a whole noodle movement. But when we select our second joint and we move that, we can start to see where the root joint is affecting these vertexes here. Everything that's standing still at the bottom here was in red because it was being affected most heavily. And then as you move away from that, it's losing its effectiveness because it's kind of handing over those vertex weights to our center joint because those are more relevant to that area. As we move up, we get to the top joint, and if we move that, we'll see just what we saw represented in color. There's just a little bit at the top there that's being controlled by that joint's rotation.